Thank you, and welcome everyone. As Ron has mentioned, my name is Jeremy Davis. I'm a Vice President for Corporate Social Responsibility at Moody's Corporation, a global integrated risk assessment firm that empowers organizations to make better decisions by providing data, analytical solutions, trusted insights to identify opportunities and manage risks. It's my pleasure to welcome you to Beyond Recovery and Repair, Building a More Resilient Social Fabric, and also to welcome my fellow panelists for the conversation today. Kiran Gulyam-Bihari, Executive Director for Market Access at Vigeo Eiris, a rating and research agency focused on promoting economic performance, responsible investment, and sustainable value creation, and an affiliate of Moody's, where he oversees institutional relations informing Vigeo Eiris's activities from product development to partnerships, and brings over a decade of experience in the ESG assessment space. Welcome, Kiran. Also joining us is Mariela Vargova, Senior ESG Analyst with Invesco, an independent investment management firm dedicated to delivering an investment experience that helps people get more out of life, where she is responsible for implementing ESG integration across investment strategies and leading corporate engagements. I'm excited to host this session as part of the inaugural Global Impact Forum. I encourage you to ask questions in the chat box, which the team will forward to us during the discussion, and let's get started. First, we want to really set the scene for you all. As you've heard throughout the conversation, today's forum focuses on 4 key initiatives to really mobilize corporate action on the global goals: the SDG ambition, target gender equality, business ambition for a 1.5 degrees Celsius future, and young SDG innovators. The intersectionality of these themes, if we think about them, the nexus really is people, which ties back to social implications, both risks and opportunities, and the focus of our conversation today. The trends we observe today are linked not only to the recent events with COVID-19, but other long-term challenges. When we think about the topics we'll explore, such as health and safety, both physical and mental, which is really turning into a conversation of employee well-being. How companies are responding to COVID-19 has quickly become a differentiator in their brand, reputation, talent attraction, and sales. Supply chain standards and instability. We saw this as a dominant theme, particularly at Moody's, where we developed the Know Your Supplier tool in response to supply chain disruption from COVID-19 and demand customers were facing, while still needing to ensure standards around risk and compliance were met. And thinking about the transition to a 1.5 degree future, how do we ensure that that's a just transition, and what are the implications that we need to consider in that? And of course, diversity and inclusion, which cuts across all of these. When we think about the recent events of racial inequity and the focus on gender equality today, it was noted that Fortune 500 female CEOs hit a record high this year, but still represent less than 8% of companies in the listing, despite research showing that greater female representation in the C-suite and on boards often leads to more profitability. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who told the story of when sometimes asked, when will there be enough women on the Supreme Court, would say, when there are 9, and noted how people were shocked, but that there'd been 9 men and nobody ever raised the question. So it's not just about gender inclusion in the workplace, but gender lens investing, supporting women business owners in the supply chain, and throughout. We'll also talk about the role labor rights, tax, wage stagnation, and populism has played. And with that, would love to address the first question to Kiran. Kiran, what has Vigeo Eiris observed in social risks pre and during COVID-19? And have things changed or just simply been illuminated further?
Thanks very much, Jeremy, and hi to everyone on the line. So I'd say pre-COVID at a corporate level, the overall picture in terms of social risk management from our research and our data has been one of quite a flat and a patchy performance that really is reflective of a social fabric in poor health. When we look at our research over the last 10 years in particular, so from the 2008 crisis to today, we really see flat and very limited performances in terms of how companies are tackling risks like labor risk, human rights, and supply chains. Now, it's true that over time, companies have become much better at disclosing the policies that they're putting in place in order to manage these kinds of issues. But when it comes to providing more detail on the real operational due diligence, there's a gap there, and it's fair to say that there is a hole that will need to be plugged in the coming decade. It's fair to say that, again, some sectors are maturing faster than others, and it's typically those that are the most exposed to social risk, like extractives, that we see the most progress being made in spite of recurrent controversies. I think you can differentiate within the field of social risk this segment of human capital. So when we talk about career management and when we talk about non-discrimination, diversity, and even workplace health and safety, it's fair to say that in terms of corporate performance over the last 10 years, at least in terms of disclosures, we're seeing more information there, and we're better able to provide investors with meaningful information on how companies are looking to tackle these kinds of risks. But make no mistake about it, pre-COVID, that overall picture is really quite a flat and concerning one in terms of social risk management. Now, shifting away from corporates and thinking about the world of sustainable finance, if you think about it, there's a real clarity to the extent that green was a much more dominant part of the narrative than social. So that's reflected in bond issuances, where green bonds are still far more common than social bonds. If you look to the index space, you see a lot of low carbon or no carbon indices, but that kind of innovation on social indices, human rights benchmarks, that's still something that's developing over time. You could look within the microcosm of the European Union and see this green taxonomy that's being rolled out, but a social taxonomy is still a little bit behind. And then you can look to reporting and the TCFD standards and realize that there are more mature and developing frameworks for climate risk. And when you look to the social side, there is, again, work to be done. So that was very much the pre-COVID picture. When you think about then the impact of the pandemic on all of this, really what we saw from our perspective as a rating agency was the landscape shifting very quickly, almost overnight. So at a corporate level, there was a swift rise in the number of ESG controversies being faced by companies, issues around health and safety, issues around social dialogue, issues around supply chains, customer information, even spreading as far as executive remuneration. And that also fed into then a real shift at the investor level. We saw a rise really in the interest that investors were playing in how their investee companies were positioning themselves to manage these operational risks. So really in a matter of weeks, the management of social risk factors by companies became both an operational concern, a disclosure imperative, and really a prime topic for investor relations and investor engagements. Jeremy, your question asked, has anything changed or has that just been illuminated? And I think it's fair to say that these social risks that we're talking about a lot today, they were already there. What COVID-19 did really was to expose the gravity and the severity of the situations faced at both company level and then also at sovereign level.
Thanks, Karen. And talking about investor engagement is a nice transition. I think we've heard over the course of the first 2 days of Uniting Business Live, certainly the case made for why these matters, social risks impact society and the importance for stakeholders, particularly in communities around these topics. I think what we really need to help people understand is why should this matter to the capital markets and kind of why the need to tackle it head on. And you mentioned kind of the role that investor engagement plays in that. And so, Mariella, would love to bring you into the conversation and ask you, why should investors care about this or take this seriously, and what's in it for them?
Yeah, thank you, Jeremy. It's a great question. It's great to be here. Well, let's make sure that social issues have always been one of the pillars of environmental, social, and governance investing, ESG investing. What we experience today is the realization that social risks have been undervalued, and social risks such as income disparity, economic and racial injustice. And now those have significant impacts on the economy and our society as a whole. what we also realize today is that social risks don't exist in isolations, but they are part of the social fabric, a web of socioeconomic and environmental relations that impact our economic and social life. So what investors can do? Investors can address social risks by reallocating capital in a responsible way towards creating social equity, seeking solutions and seeking long-term value creations in more equitable and prosperous way. But in order for investors to do that, I believe three other structural changes need to take place. First, in the capital markets, we need financial stability and how social risk accountability is embedded into forward-looking social resilience scenarios, the same way that we build scenarios today to address climate change and to see how the financial system can address climate change in the long term. Second, it's about industries and businesses. Kieran mentioned how companies are changing behavior. We're really seeking from companies and from businesses to change the way social equity issues are embedded into their products and services. So that's a transformation. And third, it's about public policy. It's true, we spend a lot of time on climate change disclosures, but it's time for social taxonomy to take place. And I believe much more qualitative data. So far, social issues, we try to quantify them as the same way we quantify climate change in environmental metrics, but maybe a more qualitative approach towards the culture of social equity, of social justice in our capital markets, our business, in our investment community. I think that's what it's needed.
Thank you. And building on that, Kieran, can you provide some examples from Vidya or Iris of where you have seen financially material social risk controversies come to light?
Yep, sure thing. So there are plenty of examples of how social factors result in financial penalties or operational costs for companies. And they range from your kind of standard discrimination payouts to health and safety challenges. You can think of instances like the black lung payouts in the mining sector, and there are many others from a similar fashion. I'd say often the most dramatic operational costs and evident examples of real materiality are when you come down to strikes. And so in 2019, General Motors, they went through what was at the time one of the longest auto worker strikes in 50 years, with over 40,000 of their employees on strike. Now, that strike lasted a total of 6 weeks, and as the strike went on, the impact spread effectively from the sites and then through to the supply chain as well, and then on it went. In total, the cost to General Motors was an estimated $2 billion in terms of lost production and $1 billion in terms of lost wages. And so there you've got a very clear example of how a social risk that effectively escalates can result in a very clear financial penalty for a company. Now, controversies are one thing. I think it's also important to talk about the efficiency boost and the leverage that the effective management of social issues can bring to a company. And there are, again, plenty of great examples of that we can point to. Vodafone, for example, they released the policy a few years ago, a global policy offering 16 weeks of paid parental leave to all of their employees. So this covered people becoming parents through surrogacy, as well as non-birthing parents. This covered people regardless of gender, regardless of sexual orientation, regardless of the length of their service. And they really couched that as a statement of intent in terms of their values and their commitment towards discrimination, diversity, and inclusion. But they also tasked at the same time as they were developing this, they tasked KPMG with establishing the business case for this policy. And when KPMG factored in the cost of recruiting and then training new employees into the workforce to replace women that hadn't stayed as a result of having children, they clocked the potential savings for global business at around $19 billion a year. I think a more modern example or more contemporary example that I think everyone can relate to is really around this idea of flexi time. So in 2020, it's now the norm for many employees, if not all employees, to be working predominantly from their homes. But that definitely wasn't the case on January the 1st of this year. And so for companies that had already adopted flexible working policies where they were encouraging and enabling their employees to work from home, when lockdowns began to be imposed across different jurisdictions, they had a clear head start in being able to mobilize and then normalize this idea of employees working from home. So again, I think that's an example of how social risk management really can translate that into the opportunity side of things. So in answer to your question, yes, there are controversies, and yes, they can result in financial penalties. But the other side of the coin as well, I think, is equally interesting in terms of efficiency, in terms of opportunity as well.
Yeah, and I think, viewing social risks through an opportunity lens in terms of mitigating the risk or identifying it early on, and building into the theme of our discussion, the resilience, so that you can have that program or policy in place and really activate it when you do face kind of shock event, is key. And building on that point, Mariella, from an investor's standpoint at Invesco, what's your approach on kind of engaging around the issue of social risks and opportunities in terms of either your own internal analysis or how you engage externally?
Yes. Well, social risks and social issues, as I mentioned, they've been always part of our environmental, social, and governance research. And we engage with the topic both internally with portfolio managers and analysts, as well as externally with portfolio companies and our investments. It's really at the core of our approach of how we understand responsible allocation of capital. And just to give you an example, ESG integration is an effort that Invesco is taking seriously, and we're in a process of integrating environmental, social, and governance awareness across our investment strategies. Before, ESG investing was predominantly an issue and preoccupation of public equities, and later on fixed income. Today we see that social issues as part of ESG investing is a matter of risk management and seeking opportunities across all asset classes. So internally, it's an educational and also an investment process of integration, social awareness. We are creating a proprietary rating system which allows our investors to identify very early on material social issues across different industries and to inform their investment decisions. In this way, embedding social awareness and social risk into portfolios, we believe will ensure long-term performance and will make our portfolios much more resilient. Externally, we engage with our companies, portfolio companies, and not only this year amid COVID-19 and the social justice movements globally, but it's always been at the core of our engagement, seeking to improve corporate practices. And just to give you an example about the range of issues that we engage, it's human capital management and employee engagement, because we believe that companies that engage with their workforce and provide good benefits and good practices at work, we believe that those companies will outperform. So we really want to engage with companies to encourage such type of investment in their human capital. Also, supply chain is material. We mentioned how a pandemic or any other natural catastrophe can disrupt supply chain. So we want to make sure that our companies have invested in a resilient supply chain. And in general, just looking at social risk and social issues across the value chain, that is our approach.
Yeah, I heard you kind of touch on two themes that have emerged this week. One is really the shift to responsible capitalism, and two, the importance of integration of ESG, right, into the overall corporate strategy. And I guess building on that, Kieran, would love to hear from your perspective at Vidya Iris. What are you observing over kind of the immediate short term in response, as well as the long term and to that, building resiliency around integration and the shift to responsible capitalism? We know that not all social risks are equal, nor are they addressed equally. and certainly have seen a kind of rising importance of topics like tax and mental health. Mariella just touched on supply chain, both standards and resilience. So what are you seeing at Vigeo Eiris, both the short and long term around these topics?
Sure, and maybe I'll start there by kind of repackaging what both you and Mariella have just said, which is really to showcase how complex social risk is. It begins in supply chains, it then enters into a company's management of their workforce, it then goes on to their consumers and customers at the end. So there's a lot to manage, and certainly even before COVID, there was a lot of dynamism to how these risks were evolving and changing over time, partly as a result of politics, populism, for example, but also as a result of technological changes. If I look back, and if I look really far back for a long-term trend that is concerning from both a corporate perspective, but also from a development perspective, I think the stagnation of fundamental labor rights, that is certainly a concern. So corporate social responsibility, ESG disclosures, they have really advanced significantly over the last decade, and certainly over the last 20 years since the launch of the Global Compact. But even today, and even within jurisdictions such as Europe, where there is much more of a unionized culture, finding disclosures on that angle and being able to analyze and understand the quality of relations between the workforce and corporate management, that is not an easy task for a rating agency or for an investor. And when you contextualize that in the situation where so many of us find ourselves today, right, with a global restructuring of our economies, some of it pushed by energy transition priorities, some of it pushed by digitalization and automation of workforces, and certainly all of it exacerbated by COVID-19, this disconnect, if you like, or this inability to really see and really measure the relationship between the workforce and companies in the unionized structure, I think that is certainly a long-term trend in decline, well documented, that is certainly of concern, I think, to many actors today. If I'm projecting forward and if I'm thinking about specific kinds of social risks that may become more material to corporates and investors in the coming years, again, as a result of the current context, there are two that I would point to. Now, the first one is tax transparency. Again, across so many economies right now, states are having to contend with the need to invest more in infrastructure, particularly in social infrastructure, in communities and ecologies, without driving deficits that become unhealthy and unreasonable to manage. And so revisiting tax code seems somewhat inevitable in many countries. And as always, there will be winners and losers to that. Today, Vigeo Eiris has been assessing tax transparency from companies at a very high level for a number of years. Effectively, we're looking for disclosures, and ideally disclosures at a country level breakdown. And that is something that is, again, very, very rare. There are a small pool, a small pocket of best practice performers, but generally speaking, it's why we recognize that this is not an area where companies excel on today. I think given the context, that will become more important to their stakeholders and to governments as well in the coming years. The other social risks that I think will be very, very material to companies, and again, should be to investors, will be mental health. So pre-COVID, I would wager that many of us were already spending too much time looking at screens, looking at our phones, looking at our computers. But COVID-19, again, has really served to exacerbate that. And this webinar, the fact that we are here speaking on the phone, I think is case in point. And so for children having to face educational terms done by computer, for employees being socially distant from their relatives, facing job insecurity, for new employees entering the workforce and having to be onboarded remotely, there's a huge task in terms of mental health management for human resources departments in particular. I think the biggest driver of this is the way in which all of this remote working has really eliminated, to a great extent, the divide that used to exist between the home and the workplace. And so both in terms of managing the mental health of employees, but also ensuring that companies retain a competitive edge, I think mental health will emerge as a key part of that kind of health and safety umbrella of responsibilities and social risks that companies have to manage.
Thanks, Karen. So I think we've outlined why this matters beyond just kind of the values argument, why it matters for capital markets participants, and thank you both for sharing insights from your perspective on that kind of underpin that. I guess the question that remains is what are the barriers then that are preventing corporates and investors from taking more action? And I think we're able to represent three perspectives here amongst the three of us, and so would love to dive in. What I heard out of the conversation at a high level were three main things, but please add more. The first is cost, right? So while companies maybe recognize that these are issues they need to address, it certainly doesn't come without internal expense. I think also the kind of lingering question of materiality and how it's defined, both from a regulatory standpoint, which changes based on geography, as well as the concept that's emerging out of Europe around dual materiality. If we think about our conversation around a shift to responsible capitalism or stakeholder capitalism, where we're thinking beyond just investors and shareholders. So that's one. The other I heard was data, right? The ability to track social performance and risk using standardized, comparable, rigorous data. And I think you both have really interesting perspective there that you've touched on. And then the third I heard was around tools. So the tools and innovation around social is lagging kind of climate and environment. And so how do we catch up as a matter of replicating the same things, or are there more opportunities around product innovation when it comes to social? So Marielle, maybe just toss it to you to start us off, but Karen, feel free to jump in. We'd love to have more of a dialogue around those.
Yes, Jeremy, that's a wonderful question. And I believe it's about culture. I think also what is at the core of addressing social risk and seeking social equity creation, it's about changing culture. And in our conversations with companies, we raise the question of culture and how the boardroom can be involved. Board of directors of changing the way, the mindset of a corporation towards much more socially equitable management and a forward-looking strategy. So it's about culture, something that does not happen overnight.
And maybe building on that, I guess, Marielle, what would you say to, the IR team or the CFO at a company when you engage them on culture? Are you willing to adjust, kind of performance for expectations, or give them the flexibility to really invest in those culture building activities to address the kind of current state? How is that engagement and dialogue tend to be playing out?
It's about seeking an innovative way to engage with all stakeholders, with their own employees, with customers, with communities in which the companies operate, and basically making the business shifting in towards much more socially aware and equitable business. So this is at the core of our conversation, and it's something that can be expressed in disclosures, but we also something that needs time in order for the company to implement it.
Karen, go ahead. Sorry, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, no, just absolutely agree with this notion of the importance of culture. And I really think in the area of human rights, which is kind of a specific part of social risk, you see that play out a lot, because human rights by definition, right, they're fundamental and they're to be respected regardless of any other considerations. And so you often see both investors but also corporates really trying to balance this debate between the values we should uphold and this concept of protecting value, the value of the corporation, very, very clearly, much more than you would see necessarily in more well-versed issues like health and safety. In human rights, you typically come across that argument or that debate quite a lot. And so I fully agree that culture is a huge part of this equation. And last week, on the Video Iris side, we responded to the PRI's consultation around the new human rights due diligence framework that they're rolling out. And as part of that plan, there's a lot there around education and training. And I think that, again, is a vital way in which we'll encourage, I think, more market participants to adopt stronger social risk practices.
And building on that, Kieran and Mario, when we talk about culture, right? I think oftentimes we hear culture and people think of kind of the squishy feely of what your workplace is like, and we know that, you know, to make investment useful decisions, we need the hard data that investors can have confidence in. So Kieran, how at Vigio Eiris are you guys looking at metrics or data that helps capture and quantify the culture of an organization? And then maybe Mariella, you can add in kind of from the investor engagement perspective, what are you looking for in that same area?
Yeah, so Mariella mentioned earlier this kind of the importance of having a blend of both qualitative and quantitative information. And that's the approach that we take in Vigio Eiris, not just on social risk, but really on anything that we're managing or that we're building or trying to measure. So across any ESG criteria that we look at, there are effectively 3 pillars that help us provide an opinion. So the first one is very qualitative in nature. We're looking at the policies that a company sets. We're looking at its trajectory in terms of what it is committing to do on health and safety or discrimination and diversity. The second kind of set of indicators we look are, again, quite qualitative in nature. We look at what companies are actually doing. Are they undertaking risk assessments, audits, training for their employees? And then in the third pillar, we're really looking at KPIs and metrics where they are available. So in some areas, such as health and safety, right, you can find long-term injury frequency rates, fatality rates. And so finding quantifiable metrics, that's something that's practically possible. But in other areas, it can be much more difficult. In the respect of fundamental human rights or in the respect of labor rights, we may look for indicators such as the share of the workforce that are unionized, but the actual disclosures tend to be quite few and far between. So at that data level, what we try and provide to investors is a systematic blend of both the qualitative, just because there is more of that, but also the quantitative as well.
I agree with that. And if I can just add, for investors increasingly today, it's important to get data on very specialized topics of our research, like in order to address and to incorporate social risks issues into our investment processes, we need to get a good reliable data on these issues. So sometimes we really look from our research providers a specialized data that address issues such as diversity, racial injustice, or any metrics that we haven't used in the past from traditional point of view.
And I just add to that, I'm ever the optimist, Jeremy. And so when I look at how far we've come in terms of setting up frameworks in different areas of ESG, particularly on climate risk, right? What has happened on the TCFD reporting framework, that's a huge step forward. And what's happened in Europe around the taxonomy framework, again, another big step forward. You know, optimistically, I would say that with collaboration across different stakeholders, from investors to corporates to NGOs, regulators and rating agencies, building a stronger and more, I think, adoptable framework of indicators, qualitative and quantitative, that can be applied and adopted across the board. I think that is something that is within our reach. If we can maintain some of the urgency that we feel today when it comes to addressing these kinds of issues of social risk.
Yeah, I agree. I think the more optimism, the better in these times. And I think we're starting to see that, right? And just in the last, 6 to 8 weeks, we've seen IOSCO come out. We've seen the GRI SASB further collaboration piece. I think it was just today or yesterday that International Business Council, followed up on their announcement that WEF, the World Economic Forum, in terms of the big four coming together to put together standards. So it does feel like there's quite a sense of urgency and momentum in the market around trying to get to some level of harmonization and standardization amongst data around these topics. And once we have the data in a place that investors and other market participants feel confident, and I think we'll start to see some of the innovation really unlock itself. And building on that, would love to hear from both of you. Kind of the third thing I feel like we touched on in terms of barriers is that innovation in terms of products and tools to move more capital into this. And Monday we saw certainly the commitment at the corporate level with both the CEO statement that was announced in the morning for renewed global cooperation, and then the launch of the CFO principles for SDG integrated finance. What else do you feel like is needed, or what would you like to see from a tools and innovation, product innovation standpoint? Maybe Mariella, we can start with you.
Yes, of course. Well, I think that increasingly we see demand in the marketplace about new innovation, especially in the area of social equity and innovative investment solutions that address social risks and also identify opportunities to have a positive social impact, whether through the sustainable development goals or thematic investment. So it's really an exciting space actually right now in the investment industry, and it's a very creative time in order to address those long-standing social systemic issues through financial vehicles. And I think that that's why that's a moment when the investment community needs to collaborate a lot with data, and we are in need of qualitative, reliable data on social issues in order to implement those financial innovations. So I think the marketplace will see a lot of innovation coming up.
Yeah, adding to that, I'd say we're seeing already some positive indications. So social bonds have existed as a tool to kind of channel support for socially focused projects. They've always lagged behind in terms of the number issued and the total volume of those issuances behind green bonds. But this year we've really seen a step change there. At Vigil Iris, we provide second-party opinions, and we've been happy and I'm very proud to support a number of social bonds looking to support investments in healthcare and in social security systems as well. Now, we have done in the past some index products, indices built around employee well-being. They're still, I would say, relatively few and far between and nowhere near as popular as the work that you see done on climate and carbon. But again, that's the kind of innovation that is required. Now, one thing that I think has worked in the past in terms of stimulating activity has been kind of benchmarking activities, whether that's in the form of labels or rankings around social issues. And there are a number that exist. I think of the corporate human rights benchmark, for example. But I think those kinds of activities, so these are all elements that we have tried in the past and that have worked to some extent. It's the prime opportunity and the prime moment for them to be developed. The interest is there, the need is there from civil society. And so again, it's incumbent on a range of different market participants to really try and make that happen.
Great. Mariella, anything to add to that?
Yes, I think that we should acknowledge the fact that human rights issues as part of a social fabric of our research and investment universe are becoming at the forefront. And I really think that it will shape the way the investment community is not only integrating social issues into investment processes across asset classes, but also how we engage with our investment companies and with governments and also with other stakeholders in society and the economy. So human rights for me, in my view, will be a really dominant topic alongside climate change in the next several years that will shift the investor focus and behavior and will define how we do our analysis and also how we innovate in terms of products and solutions.
Yeah, agreed. I think it was last week I saw that year to date, 40% of passive inflows are into ESG funds. And so I think, to your point, Kieran, kind of on social, particularly pre-COVID lagging environmental and climate, it's also, I feel like, been largely contained to kind of social bonds or really focused niche investors and asset managers and products. And I think we're now seeing it really become part of, to what you were saying, Mariella, the mainstream investment thesis and analysis and process across all asset classes. And so, certainly expect that to continue to grow. Kieran, maybe you can talk a little bit about what you're seeing. You mentioned social bonds and kind of the step change there. In terms of, are you seeing a move out of social bonds to other things like SDG linked or sustainability linked products? And does it tend to stay just at kind of the proper bond level, or are you seeing kind of other instruments emerge? I know Vidya Iris provides a number of second party opinions on the topics.
I think the sustainable finance field in general, it's fascinating to just see the amount of product evolution that is going. So we've moved from a field dominated by sustainability bonds to one then characterized by a huge growth in sustainability-linked loans, and now the emergence of sustainability-linked bonds as well. The main trend change this year has certainly been the volume and number of social bond issuances that are rising. That is certainly a change, and I think one that is set to be the case for some time. The gravity of the challenges, and if we go back to the title of this piece, right, when we think about the amount of social fabric that requires both stitching back together, but also kind of conversion into something much more vibrant, there is a significant amount of investment required to make that a reality. We heard, I think it was last week or the week before, that as a result of COVID-19, the achievement of the SDGs has been set back. And so we understand, and I think everyone knows, there's a huge effort required from civil society going forward. So I think within the sustainable finance field, there's a lot of innovation going on, but it's not necessarily just linked to social risk issues. One thing that I think is both a reflection of increasing maturity, but also an increasingly complex element to address, is the fact that we are beginning to tie together the link between social and environmental issues. And Jeremy, you mentioned the just transition earlier. That's the perfect example of how focused work to try and manage an energy transition concern, if it's not balanced with a view towards the communities and workers that can be impacted by the kind of transitions that are required, you're just simply transferring risk from one stakeholder to another. That's one great example of how environmental and social risks are now being tied together on the kind of one umbrella action. Another example I'd say that's emerging rapidly is in biodiversity, where we're beginning to recognize that the impacts that we have on biodiversity, whether that's through deforestation or through the elimination of biodiversity at genetic level, really results then in social risks, in increased prevalence of pandemics and other kinds of concerns now for us to manage. And so on the one hand, it's positive. It's a much more holistic approach that really helps to tie together things between either an SDG framework or a true ESG framework. But on the other hand, it's immensely complex, I think, for everyone to wrap their head around when you're trying to set either an investment policy or you're trying to set a corporate policy, because you're having to do or really tackle head on the challenge that is at the heart of ESG, which is how do you tie economic, ecological, and societal goals together in a meaningful manner. It's not easy, and it's why I constantly have a look of confusion on my face.
Yeah, no, I think you touched on a really important part that we tried to outlay at the beginning, which is the critical importance of the intersectionality of these issues. I think, from my perspective, pre-COVID, it was very much the case that things were bucketed into E, S, or G, and what COVID has done is really expose and illuminate how these things are intersectionally related, and that you can't just simply view them through one, neat letter lens, that you have to kind of widen the aperture and look more holistically at the whole value chain and where you're engaging with that. And just moving to kind of the so what, right? So how do we move from reaction to resilience? It's, UN General Assembly Week and Climate Week. We're here at Uniting Business Live. I think the points have been well made and well articulated. And much of what it seems we're asking corporates to do and engage on is largely already articulated in many of the existing frameworks and principles, like the UN Global Compact, the Sustainable Development Goals, et cetera. And while, Kieran, you highlighted, the scale of the challenges may certainly be deepening, I don't think we're at a point where we're asking to reinvent the wheel. It's a matter of how do we connect the dots, and to Mariella, your point, you mentioned, how do we really engage and partner more closely across the value chain to drive towards some of these solutions. So just want to talk a little bit about what are the practical steps towards those resilience models for corporates and investors. And from my perspective, and I think we talked a little bit about this in our prep for the session, we all agree that, for corporates, it's really the importance of taking that first step on a journey, and not viewing things through a binary mindset of waiting for things to be perfect, but going when they're good. And Mariella, I think you were talking about this a little bit, so feel free to jump in. But that part of that willingness to engage with stakeholders is acknowledging kind of where you are, where you're looking to go, and what's the strategy and process to get there.
No, Jeremy, I absolutely agree with you. It is about a conversation, and I don't believe that there is one constituent group in economy and society that can do it alone. Investors seek solutions and deploy capital towards building social equity, but they can do that together within public policies that favors disclosures, that support social taxonomy, that's in collaboration with businesses, that transforms their culture and also transform the way they relate to their constituents, employees, consumers, and communities of operations. So it's really a broader conversation in which all of us need to participate in order to have an impact and to have leverage to address social risks and especially issues of systemic injustices. So it's a collaborative environment that I think it's needed more than ever.
Kieran, what's your take?
So agreed, and if I think about urgent elements that need to frame what response or really what a change looks like, one concern would be maintaining the sense of urgency and the posture that we have right now. COVID feels like it's endless, and social risk feels like it's cemented firmly at the top of our minds. But there's every chance that context will fade over time, and that the prioritization of social risks may fade to the back once again. And so again, going back to the topic of this panel, I think maintaining that sense of urgency, but then also committing to build back better, which is the phrase used in some areas, or to really not simply recover, but build a more resilient social fabric. That's the mindset that needs to be applied. There are actions, I think, that are being put on the table that will help both investors and corporates in this respect. So PRI signatories in the coming years, they will have to report on their human rights due diligence frameworks, and that will, again, encourage and stimulate the kind of investigative work that that needs to be done. We've talked already about data barriers. Again, there'll be collaboration needed between people who provide reporting frameworks, but then also investors in terms of what material information they're looking to extract. That will be important. So moving to those specifics as quickly as possible in the coming years, absolutely vital. The only thing I would add to that is really ensuring that there's a full appreciation of that whole value chain of social risk, just because it is so long, from that supply chain to the employees to the consumers at the end. That is the level of maturity required in order to tackle this this challenge, if you like, in a systematic and effective manner. And one last thing, sorry, Jeremy. What you said about fundamentals is exactly right. You know, no one is necessarily asking the world of companies in terms of what we're requesting from them. The UN set effectively the principles that we ask companies to respect decades ago, and they remain very much relevant, and they remain very much the frame of what we as a rating agency request of companies. How do you respect fundamental labor rights, non-discrimination, diversity? There has been no massive reinvention in terms of the ask. It's really the action that is vital.
Correct. And one question we got from the audience just kind of builds on the topic we've been discussing is, you know, the term social risk seems to imply or link that companies doing business with human beings is a risk. And really we know that without human beings, business wouldn't exist. So perhaps, and I think we tried to touch a little bit on viewing things from maybe in the traditional definition of a risk and opportunity lens, similar to the TCFD framework. But curious if each of you had to perhaps rebrand the term social risk into something that really underscores what we're getting at here, which is the social fabric and the intersectionality of these different things, whether it's climate and racial justice or health and safety and supply chain. What would your take on that be? Not, you know, putting you on the spot. So this is your.
Mariella, do you want to go first?
I like social equity, and I think because social equity is the response to addressing social risks, and equity is the idea of investment, and it's investing in your employees, in people, in your customers. And I mean, that is at the core of good practices and creating value. And I think social equity, once it becomes part of our investment metrics, I think this will be the way to mitigate risks of social nature and to build value. And I think that is at the core of a long-term ESG and responsible investing.
I like social equity as well. I think my only counter offer would be social responsibility, only because the term responsibility, it implies the need to not only take an issue seriously, but the need to act. And I think that is appropriate.
Great. Another question we had from the audience just is the focus on human rights and the factor of kind of as we look at expanding globalism and kind of the forces that are at play, when you look at you know, national discrepancies when it comes to things like healthcare and the support for human rights, how, as a multinational or an investment manager who's looking globally across a portfolio, how do you kind of look to reconcile those differences in a way that protects and promotes the human rights of individuals everywhere?
Yes, well, thank you for this question. It's an excellent question. Well, we as ESG professionals, we really identify all the possible social risks. We want to know our investments, and we also want to know the areas, the regions in which we invest, and we study and we take responsibility in engaging with, as I mentioned, with our portfolio companies. on any social and human rights issues that we deem material for our investments. And we also, in addition to that, we really try to combine our approach, both fiduciary and moral duty, which we believe that as investors compels us to see good corporate practices. So with respect to human rights, of course, we want to take leadership in the way we lead our engagements with our companies, and also to promote good respect and protection of human rights in a broader sense of the term.
Karen, maybe from a rating agency perspective, how do you see large multinationals who are operating in many different jurisdictions? How do they handle this, and how do you, from a ratings perspective, kind of look at it to ensure what you're evaluating is fit for purpose given their operations?
Sure. So let me split the question between the performance we observe and our methodological approach. So on the methodology side, we regularly face those questions. Why are you assessing us on human rights? Is it material for us? And the perspective we've always taken as a rating agency has been very much driven from our European roots and grounded in that concept of dual materiality. We're looking at the impacts of ESG factors both on companies and stakeholders. And as such, effectively, we consider fundamental human rights to be fundamental. They are there to be respected by companies regardless of where they're operating. That is how they were couched, that's how they've been phrased, and that is how we assess them. From a performance perspective, and I touched on this earlier, what we see is that discrepancy that exists between the policy setting side of what companies are improving on today, and especially in sectors where they're highly exposed to human rights, and I think of the extractives in particular. And then that gap between reporting and meaningful disclosures around due diligence systems and due diligence processes. And then in some sectors, then you couple that with that high exposure to human rights controversies. I think of Rio Tinto in the last few weeks, again, facing a very, very high profile human rights controversy, a very mature policy in place. But again, from our perspective, limited information on due diligence, and then facing a real catastrophe over their respective indigenous rights. So from a performance perspective, we see a pretty stable trend. There is a gulf there that needs to be closed in terms of actually articulating what is happening as opposed to what is being committed to.
Right. We're coming up on time, so I'll give each of you a minute or so, any closing final thoughts, and then I'll wrap us up with some takeaways based on the discussion. Mariela, maybe you first.
Yes, thank you, Jeremy. I think it was an excellent discussion, and I'm glad to hear from your own organizations and your own views how we are very much aligned, and social issues, social equity issues will be a center and focus of the investment community and capital markets. And I believe through financial innovation, we can address not only those issues, but we can find solutions. And I believe that it is to the benefit both of the communities in which we do our business, but also to our clients as fiduciary of their capital.
And I'd say in terms of my closing remarks, we've come very far. Despite all the challenges we face today, whether it's data or reporting, we've come incredibly far in 10 years, both at a macroeconomic level, but then also the corporate level. The problem is it's not far enough and it's not fast enough. And it's that acceleration that we're really looking to support and stimulate and really try and be an ally for in the coming decade. And so in terms of key takeaways for those people listening, I would just say maintaining this sense of urgency, collaborating to improve, whether that's in terms of engagements with corporates or with regulators setting reporting frameworks, collaboration and urgency, that is how we will move the needle when it comes to restoring a healthier social fabric.
Yeah, and what I heard was, this is a complex topic across the value chain. It really requires a change in corporate culture, and that the move to social equity or responsibility is really going to be driven by maintaining that sense of urgency and the need to act, whether that's at a corporate level, the action to enable more resilience and mature governance approaches to these issues and taking that first step on the journey. From an investor perspective, increasing action in terms of engagement and product innovation and tools that really stimulate behavior and direct more capital to addressing these issues. And then from a ratings agency's perspective, really acting to encourage better disclosures that are standardized, comparable, rigorous quality to allow that transparency to the market so that participants can make better decisions. Kieran, Mariela, thank you so much for joining us. To the audience, we hope you enjoyed the discussion and look forward to continuing to engage.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks all.